And welcome back. What an absolutely fascinating set of talks. I think my head's still reeling from all of that. Thank you so much for your questions. If we can't get through to all of them, then the speakers have kindly agreed to answer by email. And I'd like to invite the speakers to come off mute. Thank you. Who would have thought that you could turn to computational statistics to solve the question of the potential politicizing of the judiciary? That was absolutely fascinating. Thank you for setting us off in that direction. And then again, who would have thought that you would see law as a source of hope in some of the most tragic situations around the world? I think I'm fascinated by the need to generate respect for international human rights law rather than relying on compliance. And I think we're talking a lot about compliance and behaviour at the moment in terms of COVID and what's happening at the moment. And then drowning in information and data. I think that's a that's a feeling that we're all very familiar with these days in terms of social media. And I really like that, going back to basics of what do we actually want from social media? We all spend quite a lot of time on it, but what do we actually want from it? And it is providing that human connection again at a time like this when I think we all feel very much in need of that. And then, of course, coming on to the last speaker, Rowena, who spoke about the economic costs of social exclusion and that intersection between physical and mental health, but also economic status, something that is, I have to say, a subject very close to my heart. But looking at those very real net savings for the NHS, and that's very relevant, obviously, for the white paper on mental health that we hope to be seeing, hopefully, before 2022. So absolutely fascinating range of speakers there. And I'm going to start with a question for Arvind. Are you concerned about the proposed review of the Supreme Court set against the rising tide of government using secondary instruments to create new laws that have little or no political scrutiny, that are impacting on people's lives potentially, and especially those most vulnerable in society?
In a word, yes. There's a lot to be concerned about. Some of my colleagues at the law school have been doing empirical research on COVID regulations. Staggeringly, as high a figure as 79% of people think that they have no opportunity to convey to the government the impact the lockdown is having on their everyday lives. There is a real sense in which the government is remote. There is also a real sense in which the government is ever more interested in closing off other avenues through which governmental power can be challenged. It's not just the judiciary that's being reviewed. There's also a review which seeks to abolish the Electoral Commission, for example. So there is very much a lot to be concerned about the move towards concentrating power, specifically in Whitehall, and the impact that will have on those with less opportunity to make their voice and to exercise voice and convey a sense of the impact policy is having on their everyday lives. Yes, absolutely. That's part of the reason why I think accountability mechanisms such as the judiciary are important.
Thank you. And I'm going to follow up with this question. This was a fascinating, coherent analysis, and I'm relieved that analysis supports the view that the Supreme Court is a defender of democracy. Did you uncover any ways in which the process could be improved to bolster the public's confidence in it following high-profile criticisms?
Well, the interesting thing is the public do, in fact, have a lot of confidence in the judiciary. We haven't had surveys done recently, but the last, the 2014 edition of the British Social Attitude Survey discovered that 82% of the population thought the judiciary treated fairly. In comparison, only 18% of the population thought politicians put the national interest above party interest. So there's no comparison between the confidence people have in the judiciary and in the public. Likewise, the same survey showed that people gave an average rating of 8.6 out of 10 in importance to the courts being able to stop the government acting beyond its authority. The confidence is there. The difficulty is that it's the politicians and the government who act contrary to the popular confidence and the popular importance attached to an independent judiciary. That's really the challenge. It's restraining the government from ending what is one of the most important and most popular accountability mechanisms we currently have.
Thank you very much. And I highly commend reading the British Attitude Survey on a range of issues. It's absolutely fascinating and sometimes quite contradictory. That's what I find very interesting. Moving on to Ioana, what's the most positive example of religious leader involvement that the world could learn from?
Thank you. This is a really tough question and could get me into some dramatic trouble. It is a really good question, and I like talking about the positives, especially as international lawyers. We tend to focus on violations and forget that the law is very often respected. So let me give you some thoughts on positive examples. I could cite from our current work the role of the Pope and the Catholic Church in Colombia during the ongoing conflicts or during the peace negotiations between the government and the FARC. Or I could cite the 126 male religious leaders, Islamic religious leaders, that have provided a counter interpretation of Quranic verses, counter to the ISIS interpretation that encouraged rape and slavery. So these leaders clearly stated that enslavement has been universally abrogated and cannot be justified based on Quranic interpretations. So these are two examples that I could cite. But what I'd rather like to do is talk to you about something else, about the Solomon Islands conflict that lasted between 1998 and 2003. And there we have women's religious groups that typically conducted their activities through church groups. So they were collective form of activities. And what they did was to engage with both sides in the conflict through food provisions. And while doing that, they're insisting on compliance and respect of humanitarian norms. Now, you have very little research on what these women religious leaders have done. And this is because they don't have the public platforms that maybe the Pope and other, bishops and other religious leaders may have. Tends to be male religious leaders, also because of how religious hierarchies, institutional hierarchies, are constructed and reinforced. So they are not that publicly visible, but their work on the ground has been instrumental during the conflict and also in the transitional justice period after the conflict, and has led to a sort of more grounded reconciliation in the Solomon Islands. So what I want to point out is that it's very difficult to choose the most important act of religious leaders. But when we do choose, we need to keep in mind the less visible forms and especially collective forms of religious leadership. Because then if we don't do that, the risk is that we are missing out on who the influencers on the ground actually are, simply because they don't conform to our view of what religious leadership should be, whether that's a Western view, whether that's a male-dominated view. These are questions that we're looking at.
Great, thank you. I think you managed to save your diplomatic skin there very eloquently and elegantly. So well done. Deborah, given how much social media channels proliferate and go in and out of fashion with different audiences so rapidly, how can a management school's education and research provision keep pace, or can it only ever analyse retrospectively?
That's a very interesting question. I think at the moment, as a management school, we are looking at this. We offer courses that look at digital marketing, and but I think one of the things that I was asked originally when we did these talks was numbers on social media, and I actually refused to do that because it does go out of fashion very, very quickly, and there are so many channels, as you say. I think what we're trying to look at, and what I've tried to give a flavour of in my talk, is that we shouldn't forget our basic traditional management practices and principles and just jump on, you know, whatever the bandwagon, whatever social media is in vogue. What we need to think about very carefully is, why are we using social media, and is it relevant to our business? Undoubtedly, students and managers are going to need new skills. And, you know, I found Rowena's talk very, very interesting about the complexity of the data. And yes, we do need to learn new skills and develop new skills, particularly in data analytics. But that doesn't necessarily have to be related to a particular platform. But definitely, I think we do need some new skills, but not forget our traditional management practices at the same time.
Thank you. I'm going to move on to Rowena now. There's an increasing focus on digital health provision, especially during lockdown. Given your analysis of the need for care plans and continuity of care, how do we ensure that those are not further compromised, which will end up in the long run potentially costing the NHS more?
Great question. I think one of the things we are conscious of is that there is in fact a bit of a digital divide within mental health service users in terms of being able to access digital materials in the same way that the general population can. So already that puts their access to health services in some jeopardy compared to the general population. So that question about continuity of care, I think, is really, really pertinent. So I think there are real concerns around, particularly now under the sort of move through lockdown and so on in COVID, to have more consultations and so on online, for there to be a reduced access for people with severe mental illness. And I think in the long run, this does kind of raise concerns about what the implications are going to be for health outcomes for them, of course, both mental and physical health outcomes, and also in terms of the long run costs. So I don't really have a magic wand or answer in terms of how that could be reduced. I guess one thing is, though, that care plans are really designed and developed to try and make sure that coordination happens about their overall healthcare. So you would hope that if good care plans are drawn up, either in secondary care or in primary care, that'll help to try and sort of bridge some of those problems. But indeed, the sort of move to digitalization does pose some significant challenges.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true, and I would also add that when we've had many conversations in many areas about digital access and the digital divide and the access to broadband or devices, but actually I think there's something like 7 million people in the country who are functionally illiterate. So we do need to go back to thinking about not just can people access, but do people have the literacy skills as well as in terms of ESOL, etc. as well. So it's a really good point. And somebody has asked a great question for Rowena and Deborah. So, you know, highlighting how this intersectional approach to talks is really working. Is there an opportunity to explore the intersections between your work on how effective deployment of social media could support practitioners in delivering care plans that support those suffering with mental health illnesses? Go on, Deborah.
I think there is definitely a link here in terms of how we use the data. I mean, again, you know, what struck me about Rowena's talk was she talked about the complexity and the scale of the data. And whilst I looked at a very different audience, you know, I looked at organizations, both small and large, I think there is a need to learn how to use these data sets better. And, you know, if Rowena and her team found that incredibly complex, can you imagine how a small business or, you know, a standard organization or an individual would find it? So there is definitely a need for some training and development here. It's not going to go away. It is something, and if it's done right, it's something that's very useful. How we connect, what I've done with what Rowena's done, I'm not 100% sure, but Rowena may have some ideas on that. But I would definitely be interested in looking at how her team looked at the big data sets, because I think there's definitely something for managers and our future managers, our undergraduate students, to learn there.
I absolutely echo what you said, Deborah. I think what we have been working on quite a bit are some of the new methodologies that we can use to try and analyze some of these big data sets. So, you know, there are all sorts of interesting methodologies now around kind of data scraping, taking data off from these big platforms to try and understand them. In fact, they're being put to really interesting use to understand more about mental health. So, for example, looking at how many people search Google during lockdown on questions around depression or whatever. So there's all sorts of interesting analytics potentially available now to answer really important questions. But I think the approaches that we have developed and the methodologies are quite sophisticated and quite technically advanced. So as you say, bridging that gap between what we can do in academia with high-powered computing and high-powered software versus what somebody could do in a small business. I think there is probably a bit of a bridge there which needs to be crossed.
Mm.
And speaking of bridges, I'm coming back to Ioana with a question. You spoke very persuasively about the benefits of, oh, sorry, somebody's just put another question in, so it's jumped up. You spoke very persuasively about the benefits of engaging local leaders to influence conflict resolution. There have been many issues raised of late with behaviours of NGOs around the world. What can those NGOs learn from your work in terms of how they may need to change their modes of operation in different cultures?
Thank you. I really seem to be dealing with very good questions, very pertinent, but at the same time, a bit of a diplomatic nightmare here. No, I'm joking. This is an excellent question. And I'm not sure in how far they can learn from my work directly, or they can learn from a body of work that exists and that has been developing for the past few decades on human rights-based approaches, primarily to development, but then also in NGO work in developing countries and increasingly in developed countries, which is good. Centering the individual, the needs, the wishes, the conceptualizations to be put forward. So centering the individual in all the work that NGOs are undertaking on the ground, and most importantly, working with local actors and moving the focus in the center of operations from the global north to the global south. So I think it's a bit of a coming home moment for NGOs. But there are two other things that I want to say. So this has gone hand in hand with accountability, incentives for increasing the accountabilities of NGOs when they work, whether in conflict settings or in development settings and so on. And I think this is good, and that's what we see also with religious leaders. I have done work on the accountability of religious actors. At the same time, we need to be very aware that there are many governments around the world that use the narrative, the discourse of ensuring greater accountability of NGOs. And in doing that, what they're actually achieving and wanting to achieve is to shrink the civic space, the civil society space, to escape the monitoring of their human rights obligations, so of the state's human rights obligations. We see human rights defenders being attacked pretty much everywhere, developed and developing world. We see less space to express opinions that are opposing governments and less political space. So there is this balance that needs to be achieved, greater accountability, centering the voices of local people and ensuring that civic space is expanded and definitely not further shrinked. This is a trend.
Thank you. And one more question for Arvind. How do judges fight back on the PR front? I think you'll have to come off mute, Arvind. They can seem austere and frightening to most people. So what can they do to make the judicial process more accessible to the general public? And I think that's also referring to the lack of diversity that we know there is among the judicial bench.
Yep. I think historically, adjudication was almost clothed in some form of mystique. Various heads of the judiciary have done the best to try and move away from that. For example, the proceedings in the Supreme Court are now live streamed on the Supreme Court's website. Judges are more open about media appearances, giving public talks, and so on. I think the fact that Lady Hale was a bit of a celebrity judge has helped a lot. So the judiciary are trying. To some extent, I think it's best if they stay out of the PR battle, because the more they seem to be engaging with politicians on the politicians' terms, the more easy it is for politicians to paint them as political. The real issue we face is that historically, the two officials charged with publicly defending the judiciary were the Lord Chancellor and the Advocate General. Neither of them currently has any intention whatsoever of doing the task. The Justice Minister, indeed, often attacks the judiciary along with the rest of the government, as does the Attorney General. The bar and other such organizations are stepping up to the plate and taking on the task of defending the judiciary. But I think it's really important as well that academics, that public commentators and so on go out there and defend the judiciary. And I don't just mean in The Guardian, I mean also writing for more controversial outlets in order to get out the message of what the judiciary do. Remember, we are not facing a hostile public of our public institutions. The judiciary is the most trusted. We are facing a willing public. We've just got to combat the negativity that we see in a lot of public commentary to ensure that that public impression continues to subsist.
Great, thank you. And the final question, I'm using my chair's privilege here because this is one that I would like to know the answer to. So Rowena, what's your view of the cost effectiveness of an upstream intervention such as basic income or similar unconditional cash transfers on people's mental health? And I think this is especially pertinent at the moment when we're seeing calls for transferring cash to people rather than sending them a food pack of half a carrot and a bit of a tomato.
Great question. And as I say, incredibly pertinent in this day and age. Not something that we've specifically looked at in our research, but I think the evidence on it is actually quite limited. And most of the evidence that I'm aware of is probably in the lower middle income countries where they specifically look at cash transfers on people's mental health. And we know there's quite a very strong link between poverty and mental health. And there is certainly some evidence out there, some empirical evidence, which suggests that cash transfers in some circumstances, so for example, for child payments or whatever, can actually generate longer term mental health benefits and raise people's mental health. So there is some evidence out there. As I say, it's probably quite limited still and probably quite focused on low middle income country settings, but there is some sort of precedent and probably worth some more research in high income country settings. And I think probably the current context lends itself for us to try and perhaps explore that sort of thing and look at the cost effectiveness. One could think of a nice empirical experiment that could explore that. And I think really important issue to explore.
Thank you. As you can see in the chat, we have a next session which will start at 1:45. So please do register. There are details there. It's been a fantastic day of talks, and I'm absolutely delighted to have been asked to chair this. I've certainly learned a lot from all of our speakers, and that has probably elicited a number of books to be ordered after this. So that's always a good thing and always a pleasure. So it just remains for me to really thank our speakers, Arvind, Ioana, Deborah and Rowena, for an absolutely fascinating morning. So thank you very much.